Hey guys, and welcome to the next video in period one, this one on India. Now, we've already talked about a couple of aspects of India kind of generally in previous videos, but I wanted to go over into a couple of topics in a little bit more detail. Now, with India, thousands of years ago, the first civilization in India began in the Indus River Valley. Right? That was one of those major river valley civilizations that I talked about way in the first video. And the Indus Valley is in this area, which today would be mostly in Pakistan, a little bit into India, but along the border there. And it's dried up an awful lot over the centuries. It was a very lush, fertile region thousands of years ago when people first started settling, but it's no longer that quite as hot property anymore. But that is considered to be the heartland of civilization in the Indian subcontinent. Now, the first people to move down there was a group known as the Dravidians. Now, Dravidians, they first started to kind of settle and, harness agriculture in this area about 3,000, to 2,500 BCE or so. So, we're talking somewhere in the range of 5,000 years. So a long time ago. And they were basic agriculturalists. There wasn't anything too complex going on. You'll also sometimes hear Dravidians referred to as Harappan society. And that's because of the twin cities Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro. Right, you see them up here on the map. There's Harappa and there's Mohenjo-Daro. They are no longer cities. Actually, the cities we don't really know the exact names of the cities. They were given those names based on the local sites for what in modern day times what they were called. There's not a whole lot of written records, or we don't know too much specifically about what went on in these cities. One thing we do know was that while there wasn't much evidence of a political system, there was planning, there was wealth. And we know this because of the design of it. You see how I showed you guys this picture in an earlier video. You've got the street squares and the alleyways and the streets, and it was all very clearly laid out. It wasn't just haphazardly put together. And when you have this densely populated of an area, especially 4,000 or 5,000 years ago, it had to be a center of trade, and that implies wealth. That implies that there were social stratifications to it, and so forth. And you see the modern excavations for where these cities were. Outside of that, we don't know a ton, as I said, about these. We don't really know too much about names of rulers. We know very, very little about religion and culture and so forth. The fact that it was wealthy implies that there were social classes, but outside of that, not a ton. It began to fall into decline around 1900 BCE or so. We just know that from carbon dating on what would have been the height of the civilization and when these cities and civilization began to shrink and decline. And scientists think that maybe it had to do with loss of agriculture, of overusing the land, and climate change. We're not entirely certain, but Harappan society, the Dravidians, they were the originators of civilization on the Indian subcontinent. Now, the next major group to come in here, the Aryans. Now, the Aryans were an Indo-European people. Indo-Europeans, they talked about that in chapter 2 of the textbook. Indo-European, the term, specifically refers to a language group. It's a linguists and historians, they've done a lot of studies on this over the last century or two, and they notice commonalities between languages largely found in Europe all the way through, today Iran, Afghanistan, and northern India. You notice, Arabic groups and certainly African and even Russian groups are not a part of this. Once you go into farther Russia, Slavic ones, the heart of the Russian language is. You've got your Romance languages based on Latin. You've got your Germanic languages, English being one of them. You see the area here for England. Now, does that mean that, because we speak English, that it's easy for us to learn, modern day Hindi or, Farsi that they speak in Iran? Of course not, nor is it vice versa. But there are some basic similarities between these languages that you would not find in non-Indo-European languages, such as Arabic, Hebrew, African dialects, Chinese, Japanese, and so forth. Okay, so the Aryans were an Indo-European group, and they started to make their way, from what today would be like Eastern Europe down through, the Iranian plateau and eventually into the subcontinent. And they entered into the Indus Valley about, 1500 BCE or so. Originally, they were pastoralists. And remember, pastoralists were referring to herders. They were not industrialists. They were not people who were particularly adept at agriculture. They were largely nomadic, but eventually they started to settle, and they intermarried with the Dravidians, which is common. That's normal. One group moves into the other. You very rarely see a complete wiping out of the previous culture. Usually there's an assimilation. There's kind of this mixing that goes on, and that's what you see with them. But they did bring with them some very distinct cultural traits. First and foremost among them, the Vedas. I mentioned this in an earlier video. The Vedas were holy text. Okay, there were 4 of them. All right, so 4 holy texts. But originally they were not even written down because the Aryans, when they first got there, did not have writing. The Vedas were collections of hymns, of poems, of stories that were passed down orally. Eventually, when language developed, they were written down. And as I said, there were 4 of them, but they started out as an oral tradition. Now, the one among them that is the most prominent is the Rig Veda. The Rig Veda is considered to be the most prominent of the holy texts in Hinduism, and that is written in a written language that is no longer used, but it's considered to be the sacred script of Hinduism, and that is Sanskrit. Okay, so this one here, this is written in Sanskrit. What happened here? Oh boy. Okay. Whoops. All right, not going to go back over everything. All right, so they start to work their way down, as I said, through the plateau of Iran, plateau meaning like more of a high raised area, and down through the Indus Valley, and eventually into other areas. The Ganges, all right, that's a very sacred spot for Hindus today. That would be a big part of their heartlands. And this Aryan migration would eventually really kind of displace many of the other people and lead to a general mixing between the 2 different cultures. The caste system we get from the Aryans. Now, when the Aryans arrived, they didn't have much in the well of a very organized political structure. They were broken up into tribal units for the most part, and each one was ruled by a specific ruler. They were known as rajas. That would be a term that would carry over into the modern era, more loosely translated into princes. And that's an important thing to remember with Indian history, is that they don't have a long history of being a united empire. They were mostly more kind of, warring and independent states. But they did have a very well-defined social order. And that's what we see with the caste system. Now, you should know a good bit about the caste system from last year. I mentioned it in one of the earlier videos as well. But it originated because of this mixing between Aryans and Dravidians. Aryans looked at themselves as being a separate people, a separate racial group from the Dravidians, and so they said, we need to signify what groups are for us and what groups are for the Dravidians, the leftovers from that Harappan society. These groups became known as Varna. Now, Varna loosely translates into color, and that's what the original castes were based on. The Aryans were a slightly lighter skin color than the darker skinned Dravidians, and unfortunately, that's a trend that we see an awful lot throughout history, and even to this very day, is you see lighter skin color, kind of gives a feeling of superiority over darker. So that's not something that, came around, with the interaction between Europeans and Africans. That predates it. Now, here are your major 4 castes. You've got your Brahmins, the priests, Kshatriyas, warriors, Vaishyas, they were your herders, farmers, merchants, your middle class. And down at the bottom, you have your Sudras, your farm workers, your servants, your laborers. You notice the white. These were for Aryans. Non-Aryans were down at the bottom. So, the Dravidians, or people that favored them more racially and physically, they were down at the bottom as Sudras. Eventually, a 5th major caste would develop, and they were the pariahs, the untouchables, right, that did, the really horrible deeds. We'll talk a little more about them later. Now, subcastes would eventually develop. The subcastes were known as Jati, because within Brahmins, you'd have, different levels to it. Within warriors, you'd have different levels. Obviously Vaishyas, you weren't just merchants, and farmers weren't going to consider themselves to be completely equal. So all of the, it leads to a much more complex system. And this is what gives them identity. and as Hinduism would develop into a major religion, the caste system would very much be a part of it. It also reinforced patriarchal values. Priests, these guys up here, warriors, they were always men. You did not have female priests or warriors. So it really led to a strictly patriarchal society, one in which India is still dealing with issues. It gave rise to certain cultural traditions, such as, if you remember this one, sati, right? Where if a Hindu man dies, it was expected that they cremated bodies. They would form a funeral pyre and light the body on fire. It was expected that the wife would jump onto the fire and join him. Child brides, it was perfectly acceptable of a grown man to marry a 12-year-old girl and so forth. So you see here, in the early days of the caste system, the formation of a very patriarchal society, and that is something that would carry over into the modern era. Okay, so this is just a bit of, going into a little more detail about the basics of early Indian society, and in the next video, we will get into talking about China.